I didn't do anything. I didn't do.
When 17-year-old Terrence Mitchell walked into the upscale Cascade Lounge that humid Friday evening, he never imagined he'd end up in handcuffs. The bartender accused him of theft. The police believed her instantly, but when Terrence whispered 3 words to the officer, the entire room fell silent. What happened next would spark a movement that changed an entire city. Terrence had always been the kind of kid teachers loved and neighbors praised. He carried himself with quiet dignity, the kind that came from being raised by a mother who taught him that excellence was his only armor in a world that would judge him before he opened his mouth. His late mother, Angela, had been a paralegal who spent her evenings volunteering at legal aid clinics, helping people who couldn't afford lawyers. She died of cancer 2 years ago, leaving Terrence with an aching void and an unshakable dream of becoming a civil rights attorney. He wanted to finish what she'd started. Now he lived with his older sister, Janelle, in their modest apartment on the south side. She worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat: daytime administrative work at a nonprofit and evening shifts serving cocktails at Cascade Lounge, an upscale bar across town where the drinks cost more than their weekly grocery budget. Terrence rarely complained about their circumstances. He studied hard, maintained a 4.2 GPA, volunteered at the youth center on weekends, and led his school's debate team. He was 17, but he'd been forced to grow up much faster than that. His phone buzzed around 8 that evening while he was finishing calculus homework. It was Janelle. "Car broke down. Still at work. Can you come get me?" "I'm so sorry, T." He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his backpack, threw on his favorite hoodie, the navy one with his school's logo, and headed out into the cooling evening air. The bus ride took 45 minutes, carrying him through neighborhoods that transformed with each stop. The buildings grew taller, the cars grew shinier, and the faces in the windows grew paler. By the time he stepped off at Cascade Avenue, he was in a different world entirely. The lounge sat on a corner lot, all dark wood and ambient lighting visible through floor-to-ceiling windows. Well-dressed people clustered around high tables, laughing over craft cocktails. Terrence pushed through the heavy door, immediately hit by the smell of expensive cologne and the low thrum of jazz music. He felt every eye turn toward him as he stood in the entrance, his worn sneakers squeaking slightly on the polished floor. His backpack suddenly felt heavy, conspicuous. He squared his shoulders and walked toward the bar, scanning for his sister. The head bartender noticed him immediately. Veronica Ashford had worked at Cascade for 12 years and prided herself on reading people. She saw the hoodie, the backpack, the nervous way this kid's eyes darted around, and her jaw tightened. She watched him approach, her hand moving protectively toward her designer purse sitting on the back counter. When Terrence reached the bar, she didn't smile. "Can I help you?" Her voice was cold, clipped, more challenge than question. Terrence cleared his throat. "Yes, ma'am. I'm here to pick up my sister, Janelle. She works here." Veronica's eyes narrowed. "We don't have anyone named Janelle working here. I think you need to leave." Confusion washed over Terrence's face. He pulled out his phone, showing her the text message. "But she just asked me to come. She said her car broke down. I said we don't have a Janelle." Veronica's voice rose slightly, drawing attention from nearby patrons. "Now I'm going to ask you one more time to leave before—" She stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening in theatrical horror. Her hand flew to her mouth as she stared at the back counter where her purse sat. "Oh my God, my wallet. Where's my wallet?" The purse was slightly askew, moved maybe an inch from where she thought she'd left it. She spun back to Terrence, her finger pointing like a weapon. "You! You were standing right there. What did you do with my wallet?" Terrence's heart began hammering against his ribs. "I didn't touch anything. I just got here. I've been talking to you." "Someone call the manager." Veronica's voice carried through the lounge. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Terrence felt the weight of dozens of eyes on him, felt their assumptions crystallizing in the air. Several patrons pulled out their phones. Preston Vale, the manager, materialized from a back office, his expensive suit perfectly tailored, his salt and pepper hair immaculately styled. He took in the scene with a practiced eye, the agitated bartender, the scared black teenager, the watching crowd. His expression hardened into something Terrence recognized immediately, prejudgment wearing a professional mask. What seems to be the problem here? Preston's tone suggested he already knew. Veronica gestured dramatically. My wallet is missing from my purse. He was standing right there when it disappeared. I want my property back. Preston turned to Terrence with exaggerated patience, the kind reserved for children and criminals. Son, let's make this easy on everyone. Just empty your bag and pockets and we can all move on with our evening. The words hit Terrence like a slap. I didn't take anything. I have rights. You can't just search me because she lost her wallet. He's refusing to cooperate, Veronica announced to the room as if performing for an audience. Someone call the police. That's not necessary, Terrence started, but Preston was already pulling out his phone. Actually, I think it is. We take theft very seriously here. Terrence stood frozen, his mind racing through everything his mother had taught him about these moments. Stay calm. Don't raise your voice. Keep your hands visible. Comply, but know your rights. But knowing what to do and feeling the crushing unfairness of it were two different things. Around him, he could hear whispers, knew something was off about him. They always target nice places. Unbelievable. The police arrived with frightening speed. 2 officers, their presence somehow making the situation feel both more official and more dangerous. Officer Bradley was in his mid-40s, thick-necked and gray-haired, with the exhausted eyes of someone who'd seen too much. His partner, Officer Kowalski, was younger, eager, his hand resting on his belt with practiced casualness. They didn't ask Terrence what happened. They asked Veronica. He came in acting suspicious, she explained, her voice trembling with perfect victimhood. Wouldn't leave when I asked. I went to check on my purse and my wallet was gone. He was the only one near it. Preston stepped forward, adding his authority. These kids come in here sometimes thinking they can just help themselves. We've had problems before. Officer Bradley turned to Terrence, his expression already made up. Son, I'm going to need you to put your hands behind your back. But I didn't do anything. Terrence heard his voice crack, hated himself for it. I just came to pick up my sister. I didn't touch her purse. I didn't take anything. Resisting isn't going to help you. Bradley's hand moved to his cuffs. I'm not resisting. I'm trying to tell you what happened. Desperation crept into Terrence's voice. He looked around the room, searching for one sympathetic face, one person who might speak up. He saw only judgment and phones recording his humiliation. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire lounge. Cold metal bit into his skin as Bradley tightened them. Terrence's vision blurred with tears he refused to let fall. This couldn't be happening. He'd done everything right, stayed in school, followed the rules, been respectful. And still, here he was, being treated like a criminal because of assumptions made before he'd even spoken. Stop! That's my brother. Janelle's voice cut through the room like a knife. She burst from the kitchen area, still in her server uniform, her face a mixture of shock and rage. What are you doing to him? Ma'am, please step back, Kowalski warned. He's 17. He came to pick me up. He didn't do anything. Janelle tried to push past Kowalski, but he blocked her path. If you interfere with an arrest, I'll have to detain you too. Officer Bradley, ignoring Janelle's protests, grabbed Terrence's backpack. Let's see what we have here. He unzipped it in front of everyone, pulling out each item like evidence. A calculus textbook, a worn copy of Just Mercy, a scientific calculator, a debate team trophy, a water bottle, his student ID. No wallet, nothing remotely incriminating. The crowd murmured. Veronica's face flushed. Check his pockets. He must have hidden it. They did, roughly, patting him down while customers watched. Nothing. Bradley and Kowalski exchanged glances. Preston suggested checking the bathroom where Terrence might have stashed it. Kowalski searched thoroughly. Still nothing. But Veronica wouldn't back down, her voice rising with indignation. I know what I saw. He was right there. He must have done something with it. Terrence felt something break inside him. Not loudly, but quietly, like a hairline fracture in foundation that's been bearing too much weight. He thought of his mother, of all her lessons about dignity and justice. He thought of every time he'd been followed in a store, every time someone had clutched their purse tighter when he walked by, every time he'd had to prove he belonged somewhere, and he thought of the man he'd been secretly meeting with for the past 3 months, the father who'd been absent his entire life but had recently returned, wanting to reconnect. The father whose very existence Terrence hadn't even told Janelle about yet because the wound of abandonment was still too fresh, too complicated. Officer Bradley reached for his radio. Dispatch, we're bringing in a juvenile suspect for... My father, Terrence said quietly, the words tasting strange in his mouth. My father is... Veronica cut him off with a bitter laugh. Oh, here we go. Let me guess, your father's a lawyer? A judge? Sure, kid. A few patrons chuckled. Preston shook his head with practiced disappointment. Terrence closed his eyes, feeling the humiliation wash over him in waves. They were walking him toward the door now, his future crumbling with each step. In a few minutes, he'd have an arrest record. His scholarship applications would be jeopardized. Everything he'd worked for, everything his mother had sacrificed for, evaporating because a woman couldn't find her wallet, and everyone was too ready to believe the worst of him. As Bradley's hand pressed against his back, guiding him toward the exit and the patrol car waiting outside, Terrence made a decision. He turned his head slightly and whispered, his voice barely audible, "Call Mayor Mitchell." Bradley's hand stopped mid-motion. What did you say? Terrence spoke louder now, each word heavy with resignation and defiance. I said call Mayor Frederick Mitchell. Tell him you just arrested his son. The room went dead silent. Preston let out a nervous laugh. Nice try, kid. You really think anyone's going to... Oh my God. Officer Kowalski had his phone out, his face draining of color as he stared at the screen. He turned it toward Bradley, and Terrence watched his arresting officer's expression transform from skepticism to dawning horror. On the phone screen was the mayor's official website. There stood Frederick Mitchell, the city's first black mayor, elected just 8 months ago on a platform of police reform and economic equality, with his arm around a younger teenager at some charity event. The same teenager who now stood before them in handcuffs, his wrists already bruising. That can't be... Preston grabbed the phone, his hands shaking. His face went from tan to ashen in seconds. Janelle stared at her brother, 1,000 questions in her eyes. Terrence, Dad, when did you... He reached out 3 months ago, Terrence said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Wanted to be in our lives again. I wasn't ready to tell you yet. I wasn't sure it was real. Officer Bradley fumbled with the handcuff keys, his previous authority crumbling into panicked apology. Son, we didn't know. If we had known... Terrence looked at him with eyes older than 17. Would it have mattered if I wasn't his son? Would you have listened to me then? The question hung in the air like an accusation because everyone in that room knew the answer. Just then, a young server burst from the kitchen, breathless. Miss Ashford, I found your wallet. Every head swiveled. The server held up the leather wallet, looking confused by all the attention. It was in the kitchen, on the shelf by the time clock, where you left it when you went on break, an hour ago. The silence that followed was deafening. Veronica's face went from red to white to red again. Preston took a step back from Terrence as if physical distance could erase what had just happened. The customers who'd been so eager to judge suddenly found their drinks fascinating. Outside, a black SUV pulled up, followed by another. The doors opened and Mayor Frederick Mitchell stepped out, flanked by his chief of staff and attorney. He walked with the purposeful stride of a man who'd received a panicked call that his son had been arrested and had broken every traffic law getting there. When Frederick Mitchell entered Cascade Lounge, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. He was an imposing figure, 6'3", impeccably dressed, with the kind of presence that commanded rooms. But his eyes, when they found his son standing there with red marks on his wrists and tear tracks on his face, held something beyond authority. They held anguish. "Someone," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "want to explain why my 17-year-old son was arrested for a crime that never happened?" Preston stepped forward, his professional mask back in place but cracking at the edges. "Mr. Mayor, this was an unfortunate misunderstanding. If we'd known who he was—" "You didn't need to know who he was." Frederick's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. "You needed to know he was innocent. You needed to treat him like a human being with rights. But you didn't, did you? You saw a black teenager in a hoodie, and that was all the evidence you needed." He turned to Veronica, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. "You accused a child. You called the police on an innocent person because you couldn't keep track of your own belongings. And rather than admit your mistake, you doubled down." "Sir, I thought—" she started. "You didn't think. You assumed. There's a difference." Frederick looked at the officers next. "You handcuffed a minor without evidence. You searched him publicly, humiliated him, treated him as guilty without investigation. Is this the protocol we're training our officers to follow?" Bradley started to speak, but Frederick held up his hand. "There will be a full investigation. Officer Kowalski, Officer Bradley, you're both suspended pending review. Ms. Ashford, you'll be facing charges for filing a false police report. Mr. Vale, I imagine the Cascade Corporation's owners will want to discuss your future here." Within minutes, Preston was indeed terminated, his protests falling on deaf ears as the bar's regional director arrived, panicked about the PR nightmare unfolding. Veronica stood in shocked silence, only now understanding the consequences of her actions. The officers left quietly, their earlier authority completely evaporated. But when Frederick finally turned to his son, his face softened into something vulnerable. "Terrence, are you okay?" And Terrence, who'd held it together through the accusation, the arrest, the humiliation, finally let the tears fall. "Dad, why does it take being your son for people to believe I didn't steal anything? What about all the kids who don't have a mayor for a father? What happens to them?" Frederick had no answer that could satisfy that question. He simply pulled his son into an embrace while Janelle joined them, the three of them holding each other in the middle of a bar that had become a crime scene of a different kind, a crime of assumption, of prejudice, of dehumanization. The story exploded across the city that night. By morning, it was national news. Mayor's son falsely arrested became a rallying cry for police reform activists and a nightmare for the police department. But Frederick Mitchell, politician though he was, refused to let his son's pain become just another news cycle. He channeled it into action. 6 months later, Cascade Lounge had been transformed. The bar had closed, unable to survive the boycotts and protests. In its place stood the Angela Mitchell Youth Justice Center, named after Terrence's mother, dedicated to educating young people about their rights and providing legal aid to families targeted by racial profiling. The renovation had been funded partly by the city, partly by donations, and partly by the settlement the Mitchell family had received and immediately redirected toward the cause. Terrence stood at a podium in the center's main room, addressing a crowd of teenagers, activists, and city officials at the grand opening. He'd grown in those 6 months, not just physically, though he stood a bit taller, but in the way he carried himself. The fear had been replaced by purpose. "That night changed my life," he said, his voice steady and clear. "But not in the way you might think. Yes, I was terrified. Yes, I was humiliated. Yes, I learned what it feels like to be presumed guilty because of the color of my skin. But I also learned something else." He paused, looking out at the faces watching him. "I learned that my father's title saved me that night. And it shouldn't have had to." He continued, his words powerful in their simplicity. Every black kid, every brown kid, every person who doesn't fit someone's narrow idea of what belongs deserves the presumption of innocence. Not because of who their father is, but because of who they are. Human beings with dignity, with rights, with dreams that matter just as much as anyone else's. The applause was thunderous, but Terrence barely heard it. He was looking at his father, standing in the back of the room next to a framed photo of Angela Mitchell. Frederick had tears streaming down his face, pride and pain mixing together. Next to him, Janelle beamed, recording everything on her phone. After the speeches ended, Terrence and Frederick stood together on the center steps, watching young people of all backgrounds stream inside for the first day of free legal workshops. The evening sun cast long shadows across the street that had once been a site of Terrence's worst moment. "Your mother would be so proud," Frederick said quietly. "You're going to be an incredible attorney someday." Terrence thought about that night, about the handcuffs, about Veronica's accusations and Preston's assumptions. He thought about every young person who'd experienced something similar without a mayor for a father, without cameras recording, without a happy ending. And he thought about his mother, who'd spent her life fighting for them. "I'm not just going to be an incredible attorney, Dad," he said. "I'm going to be a necessary one." Because there are thousands of kids out there who need someone to believe them, to fight for them, to see their humanity before checking their last name. Frederick squeezed his son's shoulder. In the months since that terrible night, they'd built something fragile but real, a relationship forged in crisis but sustained by genuine effort. It would never erase the years of absence, but it was something, a beginning. Officer Bradley and Officer Kowalski had completed extensive bias training and now spent their time teaching other officers about the dangers of racial profiling, sharing Terrence's story as a cautionary tale. Veronica Ashford had been convicted of filing a false police report and sentenced to 200 hours of community service, which she was serving at the very center that had replaced her former workplace. Preston Vale had left the city entirely, his name permanently tarnished in the industry. But the real change was bigger than individual consequences. The presumed innocent initiative that Mayor Mitchell launched had implemented mandatory bias training, body cameras, and community oversight boards. It wasn't perfect. Systemic change never happened overnight. But it was progress. It was acknowledgement. It was a city saying, "We were wrong and we're going to do better." As Terrence walked back inside the center bearing his mother's name, surrounded by the sounds of young people learning about their rights and their power, he felt something he hadn't felt in that upscale bar 6 months ago. He felt hope. Not the naive kind that ignores reality, but the stubborn kind that refuses to let reality have the final word. The story of a black teenager falsely arrested in a bar had become the story of a community demanding better. And Terrence Mitchell, who'd been handcuffed for a crime he didn't commit, had unlocked something far more powerful than his own freedom. He'd unlocked a conversation a city desperately needed to have. Respect isn't about who someone's father is. It's about recognizing the humanity in everyone before it's too late.